a journalist for the Financial Times. Just as we seemed to be adapting to the economic impact of the pandemic, war broke out. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a surge in food and energy prices. People are facing a cost of living crisis on a scale not seen in decades, and central bankers are under pressure to show they're serious about fighting inflation. This year's forum will look at the implications of these and other shocks on the euro area and the world economy. We'll begin with one of the programme highlights, an introductory speech by the President of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. Madame Lagarde, the floor is yours.
Obrigado, Claire. Bom dia. Good morning to all of you. And it will not surprise any of you if the title of my speech is Price Stability and Policy Transmission in the Euro Area. Inflation in the euro area is undesirably high, and it is projected to stay that way for some time to come. And this is a great challenge for our monetary policy. In response to the changing inflation outlook, we have consistently followed the path of policy normalization since December last year, sequentially adjusting our policy stance. Net asset purchases under our various programs will come to an end this week. In July, we intend to raise our policy rates for the first time in 11 years. And we have provided some guidance for our September policy meeting and the rate path that we envisage thereafter. We will continue along this normalization path, and we will go as far as necessary to ensure that inflation stabilizes at our 2% target over the medium term. As Victor Hugo is said to have remarked, perseverance is the secret of all triumphs. So we shall persevere. At the same time, the euro area differs from some other major economies for two key reasons, and the path of normalization has to be managed accordingly. First, inflation in the euro area today is being driven by a complex mix of factors that reflect in part our economic structures and strategic dependencies. And this creates uncertainty about how quickly inflation will return to our medium-term target. In this setting, we need to act in a determined and sustained manner, incorporating our principles of gradualism and optionality. This means moving gradually if there is uncertainty about the outlook, but with the option to act decisively to any deterioration in medium-term inflation, especially if there are signs of a de-anchoring of inflation expectations. Second, the euro area has a unique institutional setup built around 19, actually soon to be 20, not yet fully integrated national financial markets, and 19, soon to be 20, national fiscal policies with limited coordination. I can see that some of our from abroad colleagues are frowning. The 20th is Croatia, which will be officially in the euro area club as of the 1st of January, but which has been approved as a full-fledged member of the euro area, hence soon to be 20. This special institutional setting presents the risk of our monetary policy stance being unevenly transmitted across the Union. And this is why we have emphasized all along that flexibility is integral to the process of normalizing our monetary policy. It is essential to allow us to deliver the necessary policy stance and protect price stability in an environment where inflation is too high. So what would I like to do today, if your attention span permits, is answer 3 questions and outline how a combination of shocks is currently hitting the euro area economy. Second, how our monetary policy stance should react to the challenges that these shocks create. And third, how can we preserve the transmission of this stance throughout the euro area? So, how are the shocks hitting the euro area economy? Broadly speaking, inflation in the euro area is being driven by 2 different types of shocks. First, the original source of inflation is an extraordinary series of external shocks. Global supply chain disruptions, coupled with surging global demand, have pushed up prices sharply for industrial goods along the pricing chain. Mismatches between supply and demand in global energy markets have led to rising energy prices for the euro area. And the unacceptable Russia-Ukraine war has amplified both of these factors while also driving up global food prices. Given its energy dependence, the euro area is experiencing these shocks acutely. The current level of food and industrial goods inflation have not been seen since the mid-80s. And the increase in the relative price of energy in recent months is much higher than the individual spikes that occurred in the 70s. Together, energy and food and industrial goods account for 82% rate seen since the start of this year. That was the first series of shocks. That is the first key in internal demand, as the economy has reopened after the pandemic. Spending is rotating from goods back to services as restrictions are being lifted, while pent-up demand for tourism and leisure activities is proving unexpectedly strong. This rebound in spending has seen services inflation rise to 3.5% in May, the highest rate seen since the mid-90s, with the highest price increases, not surprisingly, in contact-intensive services. These shocks, in particular the surge in energy prices, are driving up short-term inflation to very high levels. They are also leading to significant upward revisions to our medium-term inflation forecast. The June Eurosystem staff projections saw inflation above 2% for the whole projection horizon, converging back to slightly above our medium-term target in 2024. But the size and complexity of these shocks are also creating uncertainty about how persistent this inflation is likely to be. We are not facing a straightforward situation of generalized excess demand or overheating economy, in which case the trajectory of medium-term inflation would have been clearer. Despite the bounce back in services that I've just referred to, private consumption in the euro area is still more than 2% below its pre-pandemic level, and investment remains subdued. Although there have been signs of above-target revisions in recent months, longer-term inflation expectations currently stand at around 2% across a range of measures. This supports our baseline projection for inflation to converge back towards our medium-term inflation target. At the same time, inflation pressures are intensifying and broadening through the domestic economy. Almost 4/5 of items in the consumption basket had annual price increases above 2% in April. And this is not only a reflection of high import prices. A new ECB indicator of domestic inflation, which removes items with a high import content, currently stands above 3%. So in this environment, it is important to understand how persistent domestic price pressures are likely to become. And there are several factors worth considering here. First, inflation is starting to take root in the services sector, which is the stickiest component of inflation and has a higher weight than goods. Second, unemployment in the euro area is at a record low. Labor shortages are broad-based across sectors, and indicators of labor demand remain strong. Not as much as in other large economies, but still. This tightening of the labor market, together with the catch-up effect triggered by the high inflation environment, suggests that wages should pick up and grow. Our latest forecasts see wage growth above 4% in 22 and in 23, and at 3.7% in 24, almost double the historical average before the pandemic. Third, these factors combined have led us to project core inflation at 2.3%, core inflation, at 2.3% in 24, and in the euro area, core inflation tends to be a good indicator of headline inflation over the medium term. We are also seeing signs that the supply shocks hitting the economy could linger for longer. While it is reasonable to assume that global supply chain disruptions will gradually be resolved, the outlook for energy and commodity prices remains clouded. Unfortunately, there is not yet an end in sight in the Russia-Ukraine war, and we face the risk of cuts to supply that could keep energy prices high. That could contribute to inflation directly if it leads to further rises in energy costs, or indirectly if a higher level of energy prices makes some production uneconomic and leads to a durable loss of economic capacity. The war is also likely to accelerate green transition in Europe as a way to enhance our energy security. In the long term, this should lead to lower energy costs in Europe. But in the meantime, it could lead to price increases for rare minerals and metals, higher costs for the investment needed in clean technologies, and an expansion of carbon pricing schemes. And we all know that a less than orderly transition will be more costly. Now, that said, these shocks also have implications for growth, and as such, they can weigh on the medium-term inflation outlook, and we need to understand what we see in that regard. The external supply shock hitting the euro area are affecting spending. Rising import prices represent a terms of trade tax which reduces the total income of our economies. Households are seeing their real income being squeezed. Real wage growth has been negative for 2 consecutive quarters. And consumer surveys suggest that households are expecting their real income and consumption to decline further over the next year. Firms, for the moment, are trying to protect their margin by raising prices. But this uncertain environment is also leading them to delay investment decisions. and sales growth appears to be decelerating. The latest PMI points to no further growth in new business, and business expectations in a year's time have reached their lowest since October 2020. At the same time, spending is being supported by the boost to demand from the full reopening of the service sector in particular. And consumption is being buffered by, one, the large stock of household savings built up during the pandemic, two, fiscal support measures, and three, the continued strength of the labor market, which is helping to sustain labor income overall. But if supply shocks drag on and inflation continues to exceed wage growth by a wide margin, losses in the real income could intensify and the excess savings buffer could be eroded. The resulting hit to demand could test the resilience of the labor market and possibly temper the expected rise in labor income. So in this setting, we have revised markedly down our forecast for growth in the next 2 years. But we're still expecting positive growth rates due to the domestic buffers against the loss of growth momentum. This is our baseline. So what does that all mean for what we have coined our normalization process? Based on the overall outlook, the process of normalization, our monetary policy will continue in a determined and sustained manner. But given the uncertainty we still face, the pace of interest rate normalization cannot be defined ex ante. As I laid out in a recent blog post, the appropriate monetary policy stance has to incorporate the principles of both gradualism and optionality. Gradualism allows policymakers to assess the impact of their moves on the inflation outlook as they go, which can be a prudent strategy in times of uncertainty. Optionality ensures that policy can react nimbly to the incoming data on the economy and inflation expectations, and if uncertainty decreases, re-optimize the policy path as necessary. And indeed, there are obviously conditions in which gradualism would not be appropriate. If, for example, we were to see higher inflation threatening to de-anchor inflation expectations, or signs of a more permanent loss of economic potential that limits resources availability, we would need to withdraw accommodation more promptly to stamp out the risk of a self-fulfilling spiral. These two elements taken together, I know it's easier to say it's one or the other. Our analysis is that we need to actually blend those two together and be just more subtle and deep in the diagnosis that we have to pass and the conclusions that we draw. So these two elements taken together of our monetary policy stance underlie the Governing Council's decision of our meeting of June the 9th. Let me try to explain. Consistent with moving gradually, we announced that we will end net asset purchases under our asset purchase program on July 1st and intend to raise our 3 key interest rates by 25 basis points at our next meeting on July the 21st. We also announced that we expect to raise the key interest rates again in September, and I quote, "If the medium-term inflation outlook persists or deteriorates, a larger increment will be appropriate at the September meeting." Now, this reflects the optionality principle. If the inflation outlook does not improve, we will have sufficient information to move faster. This commitment is obviously data dependent. This optional approach to the pace of interest rate adjustment should not be confused with delaying normalization. As our policy stance rests on a clear reaction function, interest rate expectations and risk-free rates can adjust in advance. Actually, our policy adjustment is already working its way through the euro area economy. The euro STR forward rate 10 years out is around 240 basis points above its pre-pandemic level, without policy rates having yet moved. The 1 year forward real rate 1 year ahead and the 5 year forward real rate 5 years ahead are around 100 and 140 basis points higher respectively. Beyond September, the Governing Council has agreed that a gradual but sustained path of further rate increases will be appropriate. The starting point at each meeting, every 6 weeks, will be an assessment of the evolution of the shocks, their implications for the outlook, and the degree of confidence we have in inflation converging to our medium-term target. So let me talk a little bit about what is consubstantial to our monetary policy stance, which is the transmission. For these changes in our monetary policy stance to be effective, we need to preserve the orderly transmission of our stance throughout the euro area. The euro area is not one country with one fiscal authority, with one capital market union, unfortunately, and one banking union in development. So the ECB is conducting monetary policy in this incomplete monetary union, in which its policy has to be transmitted through 19, soon to be 20, different financial and sovereign bond markets. The yields on those sovereign bonds provide the benchmark for pricing all other private sector assets in the 19, soon to be 20 member states, and ultimately also for ensuring that our monetary policy impulse reaches individual firms and households throughout the whole of the euro area. If spreads, for instance, in some countries respond rapidly and disorderly to an underlying change in risk-free rates over and above what would be justified by economic fundamentals, our capacity to deliver a single monetary policy is impaired. In this situation, a change in the policy stance can be followed by an asymmetric response of financing conditions, regardless of the credit risk of individual borrowers. In such conditions, when we have what we describe as unwarranted fragmentation, preserving policy transmission is a precondition for returning inflation to our target. This is part and parcel of our mandate. But in order to preserve the orderly transmission of our policy stance throughout the euro area, we need to ensure that this repricing is not exacerbated and distorted by destabilizing market dynamics, leading to a fragmentation of our original policy impulse. That risk of fragmentation is also affected by the pandemic, which has left lasting vulnerabilities in the euro area economy. These vulnerabilities are now contributing to the uneven transmission of the normalization of our policy across jurisdictions. So the Governing Council is acting in two ways. First, we will use flexibility in reinvesting redemption coming due under the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Programme to preserve the functioning of the monetary policy transmission mechanism. In other words, those redemptions can, as appropriate, be invested within the euro system in bond markets of jurisdictions where orderly transmission is at risk. we have decided to apply this flexibility in reinvesting redemptions coming due in the PEP portfolio as of the 1st of July. Second, we have mandated the relevant Eurosystem committees, together with the ECB services, to accelerate the completion of the design of a new instrument for consideration by the Governing Council. This new instrument will have to be effective while being proportionate and containing sufficient safeguards to preserve the impetus of member states towards a sound fiscal policy. This decision lies squarely within the ECB's tradition. In the past, the ECB has made use of separate instruments to target inflation and to preserve the functioning of the monetary policy transmission mechanism. Measures to preserve transmission could be used at any level of interest rate, so long as they were designed not to interfere with the monetary policy stance. At times when inflation fell too low, it made sense to shift from separation to combination, so that all tools reinforced the required policy easing. That is why, for example, we linked asset purchases tightly to forward guidance on rates. But with high inflation now being the main challenge, there are merits in separating policy tools again. Preserving policy transmission throughout the euro area will allow rates to rise as far as necessary, and in this sense, there is no trade-off between launching this new tool and using it and adopting the necessary policy stance to stabilize inflation at our target. In fact, one enables the other. So let me conclude. The euro area is facing a complex mix of shocks which are reducing growth and pushing up inflation. In this environment, it is imperative for policymakers within their respective mandates to address the risks to the economic outlook. Fiscal policymakers have to play their part in reducing these risks by providing targeted and temporary support, while over the medium term following a rules-based framework that underpins both debt sustainability and macroeconomic stabilization. We are unwavering in our commitment to ensure that inflation returns to 2% over the medium term. We have designed a strategy to normalize our policy that allows us to respond nimbly to the high inflation environment. And we will ensure that the orderly transmission of our policy stance throughout the euro area is preserved. As Leonardo da Vinci said, every obstacle yields to stern resolve. We will address every obstacle that may pose a threat to our price stability mandate. We will. Thank you very much.
My name is Alice Yedouale. I am 27 years old and I come from France.
Hello, my name is April Meal. I am 28 years old and from the United States of America.
Hola, my name is Federico Cochen. I am 30 years old and I'm from Mexico.
I study at Stanford University. My research interests are in macroeconomics and household finance.
I'm a PhD student at the IAS at Stockholm University. In my research, I look at how firms respond to monetary policy decisions.
Interests are macroeconomics of inequality, labor markets, and optimal taxation. In this project, I study how heterogeneity in job stability affects the optimal design of pension systems.
In my paper, I find that issuing a central bank digital currency while conducting quantitative easing could decrease lending and render the central bank's balance sheet difficult to tamper.
In this paper, we propose a new framework in which we allow for bounded rationality and household heterogeneity. Our model is consistent with recent empirical findings on the effectiveness and the transmission mechanisms of monetary and fiscal policy.
In my work, I showed that the change in US firms' belief formation around the mid-1980s can help us understand two empirical challenges in the literature: the fall in inflation persistence and the flattening in the Phillips curve.
In my work, I show the country-specific features of the housing and mortgage markets are key determinants of the local impact of monetary policy.
To remind all of our participants that you have until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning local time to vote for your favourite Young Economist paper. If you're watching online, you can do this via the link that was emailed to you. For those in the room, there are booths dotted around the conference centre and you can vote through them. Digital technologies offer possibilities for firms to look further afield, for workers and would-be employees to have more choice about from where and how they work. Similarly, Globotics gives companies the ability to use automated processes regardless of where they're located. But will the shift away from the bases and methods we've long grown used to be as profound as we think? Our first session will aim to answer just how deep the changes we've seen during the pandemic are likely to be in the longer term. The first session will be immediately followed by our second session, which will look at the sources and implications of the recent rise in energy prices. As the President's speech just pointed out, this has been one of, if not the prime factor in driving inflation in the euro area to its current record high. Both sessions will be chaired by Philip Lane, Executive Board Member of the European Central Bank. Philip, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and good morning, and it's a pleasure to be back in the physical format here in Sintra. Now, as already mentioned, there's also an online audience. So later on, after we've had the initial presentation and discussion, there will be, of course, always the interesting component of having questions and comments from the floor, from the actual floor here in the room, and also with also contributions online. So I encourage you to already start thinking about the questions or comments you want to make. Now, the team in designing the program always has the conundrum, which is, of course, the program is designed months in advance of this event. Papers have to be commissioned. And then the guesswork is, okay, what will be interesting questions, interesting topics by June 2022? And I think in this first session this morning, I think a very good topic has been picked. And maybe what's interesting is both of these phrases are everyday issues at the ECB, globalization and labour markets. And this session, let's see how it goes. But in bringing these two concepts together is really the goal this morning. And we have to mix. We have Richard Baldwin, who his career has been best known for his contributions in international trade. Of course, that's a very broad concept. Because of the particular intersection point here at labour markets, The discussant, Barbara Petrangelo, is one of Europe's leading labour economists. She directs the labour economics programme at the CPR, as well as her chair at Oxford. So I think it should be a very interesting session. I should say Richard, in addition to his many academic, direct personal contributions and his contributions to the CPR, I'm sure when they look back decades from now, the write-up will say editor-in-chief of Vox EU. So Vox EU is part now of our daily lives, now for maybe quite some time actually, but it's really been such a transformational development for European economics to have that as a daily site for commentaries and advertising for important work. So with that, let me hand over to Richard to make his presentation.
Thank you. Start my watch. There we go. When I was a graduate student at MIT, they told me every talk has to have 3 elements to start with. You have to start with a thanks and an apology, and since it was the United States, you also had to have a joke. So let me start with my thanks. My thanks to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to share my ideas with this very august audience, very important, quite different than my usual audience. I'm feeling a little nervous because this audience is a bit outside my usual comfort zone, so maybe I won't be thanking the organizers after I crash and burn in my presentation today, but we'll see. Now, the apology is that my paper has been late and the PowerPoint presentation has been late, so I'm especially apologizing to Barbara, who's had to struggle with the discussion for an unwritten paper. Now, since we're in Europe rather than the US, there won't be any joke, although maybe at the end of my presentation, some of you will figure out that the presentation was my joke. Okay, did I lower the expectations sufficiently here? Okay, good. Now let me start with the basic points. Globalization affects the functioning of the macroeconomy. The functioning of the macroeconomy affects monetary policy. And globalization is changing. It is therefore a real possibility that the functioning of the macroeconomy will change. Now, when I talk about change of globalization, think services and less goods. Over the last 25 years, globalization and automation of the goods sector, especially manufacturing, has completely transformed how our economies work. Some people say that's why the Phillips curve flattened, which has made policymaking difficult. Some people say that's why there was so much deflation. Now, going forward, the globalization of the goods sector, which was so important for 25 years, will diminish. Globalization in the goods sector is declining. But globalization of the service sector is rising, and rather rapidly. And here's why that matters. The service sector is far larger and far more important to the macroeconomy than the goods sector ever was. 3/4 of all workers work in the service sector. 2/3 of the GDP is produced in the service sector. But services are different in important ways. And that's what I'd like to talk about, but as it turns out, there's not enough data to have that discussion. So at the end of it all, my talk should be a sales pitch for a research project that I hope the ECB will do. There we go. So that's my basic points. Mr. Moderator, should we just go to Q&A or discussion? No? As I want, okay. So, I have some slides, so I'll go with those now. Globotics. We have to talk about globotics. Globotics is an ugly, but hopefully memorable word that I invented to try and drive home the point that globalization and robotics are being driven forward by digital technology at the same time. But this time, it's affecting white-collar and professional jobs, not just manufacturing and farm jobs. And it's happening faster than many think and in ways few expect. So that's the point of this. It's coming to the service sector, both automation and globalization to the service sector. So I'm going to talk about globalization is changing. I'm going to talk about services are important but different. Then I'm going to talk about Globotics service and HICP developments. Globalization is changing. So here's a chart that many of you will have seen before. Goods trade peaked as the offshoring expansion phase ended. So this is world goods trade, imports and exports, as a percent of GDP. And I go back to 1960, and you see from 1960 up to the early 90s, we had old-fashioned globalization driven forward by lowering trade costs and growing economies, both of which mechanically lead to a rise in the trade to GDP ratio. In the early 1990s, the ICT revolution completely changed the way globalization worked, because it made it possible to spatially unbundle stages of production in manufacturing, and it made it possible for G7 firms to offshore those factories to low-wage countries. And most importantly, they offshored their know-how as well as the factories. So that offshoring triggered rapid industrialization in a handful of developing countries, which led to very quick income, which then triggered the commodity super cycle. Now, most of the low-hanging fruit in the offshoring revolution has been picked. So it's sort of come to the boils come off. And for a variety of reasons we'll talk about, trade to GDP in goods is actually falling and has been for quite a while. So that global peak is for real, but it's somewhat deceptive. We need to be aware of false peaks and the lazy narrative that ICT started it, the global financial crisis killed it. That's the lazy narrative, and it's wrong. China, for example, peaked well before 2008. US peaked in 2011, Japan peaked in 2014, and the EU, which accounts for 30% of global trade in goods, never really peaked. It's kind of stagnated. So since we're at the ECB, let's look a little bit closer at the EU's peakers and non-peakers. So what I do with this graph is I put the growth between 2008 and 2020 on the vertical axis and the growth from 1990 to 2008 on the horizontal axis. So the countries that peaked are in the lower right corner because they grew from 90 to 2008 and they fell between 2008 and 2020. Now you can see that includes some very serious countries like Germany and France, the two largest trading countries. But if you go on the non-peakers, you see Italy, Spain, and Netherlands. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And the EU average, the EU 27 there, is just on the borderline. So when you see that first slide, it peaks in 2008 and goes down, remember that is not a globally harmonized, sudden, synchronized movement. So when you start thinking about simplistic explanations as to why globalization died, they're almost probably all wrong for a very large number of countries. Now, China is key. I guess you've heard that before. In goods, China is the largest trading country in the world, and it has a very particular path of this form of globalization. So this is imports and exports of goods over GDP. And you can see China rose very fast because they were on the receiving end of the offshoring revolution. So for a long time, they were growing incredibly quickly, but importing a huge amount of parts and components. The miracle of China is they created an industrial base, and as their industrial base grew, they stopped importing the parts and components, and now they are normalizing to a usual mega economy. So China does things differently. It's state-led capital, but what they're doing macro is not unusual. It's actually they're becoming normal. Now what is unusual is on the right chart, And that's their engagement with global supply chains. So the green line is what they're buying from global supply chain parts and components, and the blue line is what they're selling. China has now become the largest, by far, supplier of industrial goods worldwide. Every major manufacturing country in the world is heavily dependent on Chinese industrial inputs. So it's an important thing to watch. Now, this is all about goods. I want to talk about services, because goods is yesterday's story. Services is tomorrow's story. So what I'm doing with this graph here, let me come over here and bother these people instead of those people. I'm looking at the growth of a large group of services called other commercial services, and then also with goods, and I've rebased it to 1990 so we can see the effect of cumulative globalization, focus on the trends. And what you will see is, and this is not per GDP, this is the absolute level of goods trade. And you can see it rose, there's a little peak down with the global financial crisis, but it keeps going. But it's kind of petering out. Service trade, you don't see any slowing down whatsoever, potentially an acceleration. Now, over here, I show what is the ratio of other commercial services to all traded goods and services. So other commercial services is like all services except transportation and travel. So it's like Indian outsourcing, whatever, everything's in that bucket. And you can see from 1990, it went from 90% of global commerce to 20% of global commerce, and it's rising. So all of you in this room know what happens when one time series grows 2 to 3 times faster than the other one. Very soon, the dial moves a lot. And that's my main message today. Globalization and automation of the future will be about the service sector at least as much as the manufacturing sector, so we need to study that more. Okay, so this is for the Euro area 19. You see basically the same picture. Now, inside the EU, we also don't see the diversity. Almost nobody in the EU is in this peaking phase where it went up and then down. Okay, goods peaked, services not. Why? And that was the subject of my 2016 book. You didn't think, Philip, that I would come up here and not advertise my book, did you? So this is my little theory about globalization. Arbitrage drives globalization. And that arbitrage is constrained by 3 costs. Trade costs for arbitrage in goods, communication costs for arbitrage in know-how, and face-to-face costs for arbitrage in labor services. That first phase, when it was rising, it was all about lowering trade costs. The second phase, when the communication costs came down and allowed the offshoring, we got this boom in globalization. And what I'm saying here is that the digital technology lowering face-to-face cost will change globalization. In particular, Digitech is lowering face-to-face costs and allowing services cross-border telemigration. Think about remote work done internationally. Think about work from home when home is abroad. That's what I'm talking about. Direct labor market service arbitrage opened up by digital technology, which all of us have been using. And in fact, just a little hint on how bad the trade statistics are. Most of you were probably doing international trade when you did your remote work from a different country. That surely was not captured in the trade statistics. And therefore, a lot of what will go forward will not be captured in the trade statistics. Okay, now I want to move on. The future of trade is intermediate services. So there's 2 messages there. One, the future of trade is services, not manufacturing. But almost all of our mindsets, almost all of our thinking, almost all of our wisdom is based on what happens when the goods sector becomes more globalized. And I will argue that globalization of the service sector will work differently. The second message is this is not services as you may think about financial services, medical services, architectural services. It's the intermediate services, the thing that's in the service value chain. So I want to give you 4 facts and a conclusion, or a conjecture. First of all, barriers to services and trade are much higher than barriers to services and goods now. Some estimates make them hundreds of times higher, some thousands of times higher. But most barriers to trade and intermediate services are technological, not policy. There's almost no domestic regulation of who can provide, for instance, bookkeeping services, or screen CVs, or make your appointments. Digitech is lowering barriers to intermediate services at an explosive pace, and COVID accelerated that by moving us all to the frontier. Fourth, the demand for intermediate services in rich countries is huge. The capacity in emerging markets is huge. Therefore, intermediate services and trade will grow much faster than goods and trade for the foreseeable future, and since 2000, it's already been growing 2 to 3 times faster. Okay, 5 facts in a short period of time, 10 minutes. Well, okay, services are important but different. Now, what I want to do here is make the argument that we should pay attention to the fact that globalization and automation are shifting. First of all, services in the euro area are important. On the left side, you'll see services accounts for 74% of the jobs. This is in 2019. By the way, I should say the president's speech was all about what happened since 2019 with COVID and Ukraine and supply shocks and stuff. I stopped there because services did get a little weird after that. And I'm really talking about long-term structural things. So that's one of my graphs stop at 19 or 20 on purpose. So 3/4 of the jobs, 2/3 of the GDP, and 44% of the HICP weight is in services. And on the right chart, we have trends. So I've rebased it to 2001 to look at the price, at the developments over the last 10 years. And you can see the jobs are growing fast. HICP weight is growing fast, and the GDP has plateaued. So the share of GDP is somewhat plateaued. Intermediate inputs are more important in service imports than manufactured imports. So all of us have fascinated about global value chains and all the implications of that. That is essentially about trade in intermediate goods. That's what that all is about. But trade in services, the intermediates are more important in services than they are in goods, and it's increasing. As you can see, the business service is rising, whereas manufacturing is plateaued. Service intermediates are 3 times more important than manufactured intermediates in the overall economy. So what we have here is the column sectors. These are the inputs from the row sectors, and you see service intermediate inputs from the service sector are 32%. Service intermediate inputs into the manufacturing is 24%. But because the service sector is so large, 30% of the gross output of the economy is intermediate services. Now, if you go over to manufacturers, it's 5% in services, 25% in manufacturing, but since manufacturing is so small, it's only 11% of the economy. So this is, if you will, the demand for intermediate services in rich countries is huge and 3 times larger than the demand for intermediate goods. It affects every sector. I'll skip over that. Now what I want to talk about a little bit is automation. Service sector automation is different, and to mark that, I invented this word in my last book, my 2019 book, white-collar robots, to stop us thinking about robots as these physical things that work in auto factories. So computers have acquired new cognitive skills since 2016 due to machine learning. The new skills are automating service sector tasks, things like robotic process automation, virtual assistants, IBM's Watson, scheduling apps. Just notice that Outlook is starting to read my emails and create appointments in my calendar or suggest them by itself. That's a service sector task that's being automated. They didn't even ask me. But what changed? How is it that computers have changed? And I would argue that it's the programming that changed. There's been a fundamental sea change in the way we program computers. So coding computers is like thinking slow, conscious, rational, explicit. Machine learning is like thinking fast, coming from the Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast, thinking slow. Machine learning allows computers to do things where our thinking is unconscious, instantaneous, multi-tracked, and we have no idea how we're doing it. But by estimating large statistical models, we can reproduce that. And some of those services are allowing automation of the service sector in ways that was never possible before. It's the same technology that's allowing the globalization. 5, service sector automation is happening at the job or the task level, not the product level. And this is why it's hard to figure out. This is why my paper has no wow number at the end. So service sector automation varies by job. For instance, Frey and Osborne have a famous study which showed which jobs could be automated and which couldn't, and it's been reproduced in different countries, different things. Service sector globalization or teleworkability varies by job, and Dingle and Neumann and a number of other people estimated which jobs were offshoreable and which weren't, or teleworkable. By contrast, goods sector globalization and automation was at the product level. So if you want to map automation and globalization in goods into the economy and HICP, it's easy. If you want to do that for services, you have to map something that's affecting occupations into HICP elements, which is difficult. We don't have that mapping, and we don't really have the data. Okay, so this is the Globotics Quadrant, if you will. Automation and globalization of service sector occupations is happening at the same time. And all I've done here with a co-author from Japan is put the offshoreability on the vertical axis, the automatability on the horizontal axis, and put in where each occupation is according to the scores. And you can see general clerical workers with, this is US data, 6 million workers is up there, both automatable and offshoreable. But if you go down to public health nurses, midwives, and nurses, there's 6 million of them, but they're not at all offshoreable and very little automatable. But the point here is this is not an obvious correlation. So if you're thinking automation and globalization look a lot alike, as they did in manufacturing, you're wrong. You have to look at this occupation by occupation, and that's why it's hard to map into the functioning of the macroeconomy, because normally we're taking products to the macroeconomy. Okay. Now HIPC developments. I have 3 minutes and 50 seconds left. Globotics and HICP developments. and again, this is before all the exciting events that all of you spend most of your time dealing with. So take this as kind of relaxation, something that might affect your predecessors. And you won't have time to worry about this, but maybe you can get your staff to worry about it. This is structural stuff. So service inflation is higher but less volatile over the long run. And there's a very good reason for that. It's called the Balasa-Samuelson effect. So traditionally, productivity in manufacturing is faster than services, and services are less traded. So as a consequence, as globalization drags up the wages because of productivity in manufacturing, it drags up the service sector wages, and since they're not traded, they don't face the price pressure, and since they're very labor intensive, it's felt more intensively. So fast-growing economies typically have higher service inflation, but it's less volatile because there's none of this food and energy shock stuff that comes. So here's in the Eurozone, just to show you that this excess inflation of services versus industrial goods over the last 10 years is very, very common. For the average percentage point difference for the Euro area 19 is 17.5%. And what I've done here is put the size of the economy on the vertical axis and the difference on the horizontal axis. And you can see there's a gentle that large economies tend to have less of this excess inflation than small economies, and there's also a fast-growing element of it. But there's some diversity to it. Okay, there's one weird thing about services, and that's communication. Its price has been falling like crazy. The other ones have been moving relatively similar, so it's nothing to be seen here. In context, this is what the speech was about, so I'll skip that. Now, what I'd like to end with is the calculation I would have liked to have done. When Philippe Hartmann and Philip Lane asked me to do this paper, I had this idea that I could redo for the 21st century the calculation for the 2020s, the calculations that had been done in the 2000s for the impact of imported deflation because of the China shock and whatever, and offset by the commodity. I thought I would just take the service data, project forward what's happening, and see what it would do to the inflation. There's a trouble with that. This is how you calculate this thing, calculating the impact of service sector globalization. We would need domestic prices and import prices, and it would feed into the HICP inflation index. Now, the imported prices would also affect wage formation, which would affect domestic prices. The import competition would affect price-cost markups and also affect prices. And the imported prices would lead to lower cost of inputs, therefore also lower domestic prices because of a productivity gain. Now, the trouble is there are no import prices for services. Believe it or not, they don't exist. I asked the OECD. The fundamental problem is there's no customs declarations. So the way we get trade prices, for the most part, is you fill in a customs declaration which has the value of the shipment and the quantity. And you divide the value by the quantity, you get a price, something like a price out of it. Since you're not declaring quantity for service imports, only the values, you don't have that price. So there's other ways to do it, and a research project might find them, but we don't have the price of imported services, full stop. Moreover, the categories in which they are put seem to have been randomly drawn by people who did not care about the real economy. If you look at the service classifications, it's why did they put that together? You have like services for price line transmissions together with Indian outsourcing of offshore, stuff together like that. So we need to have better detail on the flows as well in order to be able to map them into the local labor market, into the product markets, into the cost of inputs, and therefore into the HICP. So I'm suggesting we need a forward-looking work program, we need price data, and we need mapping of imported services to domestic sectors and jobs, because service sector is being hit at the job level, not the sector level, and to map the hit on the jobs, which vary by occupation, into something that matters for the functioning of the market economy, we need to map jobs into products. So I'll stop right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I mean, the last point, of course, is something every day we have to deal with is how do we think about measurement issues? So the grand concepts like inflation, then you start to press on it, and then you say, okay, very deep questions here, but no doubt we'll come back to that in the discussion later on. But of course, the lead discussant is Barbara, and I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks. So thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to the ECB forum, and thanks to Richard who gave me the opportunity to read a lot of thought-provoking facts. And this is really an area to which I am an outsider, so I really learned quite a bit of very interesting evidence. So just to recap very briefly the issues that Richard pointed at. So we have witnessed massive globalization in goods with the offshoring and global supply chain for goods. And this had impacts on employment, inequality, and prices. And then now we are witnessing the next generation of international trade, and the future is going to be in services, mostly via digital technology and trade in intermediate services, as Richard was describing. This has potentially much larger reach because services account for 3/4 of GDP. Every sector in the economy uses intermediate services. Demanding in rich countries is potentially elastic, and capacity is potentially huge in emerging markets. So the key question here is really what to expect from globalization in services, and what do we need to make progress? What kind of data, what kind of approaches we need to make progress in this area? So I will first offer a sort of labor market perspectives on the impacts of globalization in goods, and then see what we can learn, what we can extract to understand the impacts of globalization in services. So this picture here is something that probably most of you are familiar with. This is the correlation between the import penetration in a number of OECD countries and the fall in manufacturing employment. The European Union countries are mostly in the middle of that diagram. So the degree of import penetration was sort of intermediate. At the sort of right extreme, there are the US, the UK, Ireland, and Iceland. So there is a clear correlation, negative correlation between import penetration from China and decline in manufacturing employment. Now, one important point to notice is that the decline in manufacturing employment was very heterogeneous across countries, given the same level of penetration of imports from China. So what this graph shows is the change in manufacturing employment for a given increase in Chinese imports. So, for example, in Norway, in Germany, the decline in manufacturing employment after an increase in imports from China, or also from other countries, in the case of Germany, was very close to zero, not significantly different from zero. While instead, it was relatively large in the US, in the UK, and even more in Spain. So the thing about the issues about import penetration and manufacturing employment is that, of course, import penetration is unevenly concentrated across industries, and employment effects are a lot more pronounced for low-income individuals, non-college educated, and to some extent, men. As I was showing before, employment in some countries was actually shielded, for example, in Germany and in Norway, and this was mostly due to public policies, for example, welfare policies, active labor market policies that would ease the reallocation of workers. But also, for example, there are countries at the other end of the spectrum, like Spain, where the impact was enormous because of a specific feature of the Spanish labor market with a very large incidence of temporary jobs. An important thing about import penetration is that there is also a geographic aspect of inequality, because manufacturing sector is relatively concentrated across space, so there have been larger differential declines in employment in areas with greater exposure to import competition. So this implied rising inequalities across areas. Okay, this is, I'm afraid these are like microdata coming from the UK. This is simply giving you an idea of who is most exposed to international trade. So basically, women of all education groups are less exposed than men, and within each gender, workers with low qualifications or no qualifications at all are more exposed than educated workers. What is more sort of recent in the research, but very, very important to the topic of this forum, is the impact of manufacturing, exposure to manufacturing trade to prices. And here, latest estimates find very large effects on prices and inflation. Indeed, I was talking about manufacturing, but the evidence I'm presenting here refers to more than 200 product categories, including both manufacturing goods and services. Services are a minority, but services are already there. And there are researchers at the LSE who found that there is a very strong association between the increase in import penetration and the fall in inflation. So basically, the result of these studies is a 1 percentage point increase in import penetration from China causes a fall in inflation by more than 2 percentage points. So this is a very large impact. And what is perhaps more interesting is the channels through which impacts are taking place. So you can have prices of imported goods and also broader impacts on the prices of locally produced goods. And this research argues that this is where most of the impact has taken place. And the reason why there was a strong impact on the prices of locally produced goods was mostly due to changes in markups, changes in market structure. Domestic producers were having to compete with rising productivity from Chinese producers, and their markup were falling. So this is the main channel through which the increase in import penetration affected inflation. So this is the correlation between the change in markups and exposure to international trade. The relationship is negative, and it's even stronger if you look at sectors of the domestic economy, for example, the US economy, in which market concentration is higher. So there is a strong impact on market concentration. Putting things together, inflation and employment, 1 percentage point increase in import penetration, as I was saying before, causes a 2.2 percentage point falls in inflation, but also a fall in employment of 1.8 percentage point. The fall in inflation could be factored into a rising consumer surplus. So here there is a very ballpark figure of an increase in about $450,000 in surplus for each job that is displaced by international trade, which makes it possible basically to compensate those who suffer job losses. And also there are distributional impacts through the composition of expenditure. So one could argue that impact penetration rose faster for products that sell relatively more to high-income groups, for example, electronics. But at the same time, the price response was larger for product groups that sell to lower-income households, for example, appliances, shoes, apparel, etc. So overall, low-income groups, I should say here, benefit proportionally more. So it's low-income groups, it's not high-income groups. Okay. There is also quite a lot of evidence of broader impacts of international trade in goods through, for example, fissures in the fabric of society, changes in the ideology, changes in electoral outcomes. I will not talk much about this because perhaps we have to make very different statements about services. We don't know yet. But the composition of the penetration of trade in services is actually quite different from the composition of the penetration in trade in goods. So this is what I had in mind about service penetration. This is also what Richard was showing about the importance of the trade in services, because services is part of every sector of the economy, and this is true in all economies in the European Union. So here I'm giving you data for just a bunch of those economies, but it's very, very consistent across countries. And most importantly, if we want to think about winners and losers, then perhaps we need to figure out that the inequality impacts on trading services are going to be quite different from the impacts on inequality that we've witnessed from the trading goods. So for example, if you look at the goods sector, on the, which are the blue bars, the share of female is relatively low, is just above 1/4, and the share of college educated is also relatively low, just below 1/4. If you look at the service sector, the gender composition is almost completely balanced, 50% women and men, and there is a much higher proportion of college-educated workers. So on the gender side, we might expect a larger relative impact on female employment than what we have seen with the globalization in goods. And this is kind of important because much of the increase in female participation over the past 50 years or so was also aided to some extent by the rise in services, which is traditionally a very female-intensive sector. So women have sort of been shielded from the impact of international trade because they were underrepresented in the manufacturing sector. This is not going to be the case with trade in services. And secondly, the incidence of college education is a lot higher in services, and this is just the total service sector. This is the average service sector, but of course the incidence of college education is a lot higher in the kind of services that are open to international competition, for example, financial services, computer services, professional services. Now, what Richard was lamenting is something to which we can all relate, the lack of data, especially data on imported services. So the kind of evidence I will show here, I'm afraid, will not come from the kind of services that Richard had in mind in terms of high-skill financial services or professional services or computer services, but will come from the other end of the spectrum of services, which are nevertheless traded with a very specific program called the European Posting Policy. So I think the evidence from the European Post is kind of interesting because it really gives us an idea of what to expect when there is international competition in services. So with this scheme, jobs in non-tradable sectors are being onshored on-site. So it's mostly about construction, cleaning, driving services, a lot of manual service tasks. So foreign firms, for example, firms in Poland, perform services in the customer's country, for example, in Germany, where the workers are only temporarily located. So posted workers stay formally employed in the sending country, but perform their services and sell their services in the receiving country. So what kind of services we're talking about is this kind of pink-red area that I've shaded in this picture. So it's about 25% of the total international trade in services, and it's almost 75% of the total flows of workers. So talking about within EU workers' flows, if you look at France, to which this picture refers, about 75% of the inflows of workers to France are coming through the European Posting Service. So this is playing a huge role, and it has been increasing over time, much faster than migration, international migration within the EU. What kind of skills, what kind of occupations we're talking about? These are very low-skill jobs, so manual jobs, mostly blue-collar, a little bit of technicians. It's really mostly like manual services, like truck driving, cleaning, and also in construction. What was the impact of that at the receiving end? This graph here shows the impact of job-posted workers on the receiving firms in France. So there are two important things to notice. Employment in those firms is falling after the liberalization of the job posting. And is falling very similarly to what we were witnessing for international trading goods. So workers are displaced from those occupations that are now performed by offshored workers. Now, another important point here, which might be important for both inequality and inflation, if you look at the orange line in that diagram, that is completely flat. So there is no impact whatsoever on local wages. So in a sense, this effect, this result mimics to some extent what we have learned from the migration literature. In most studies, we don't really observe a detrimental impact of migration on wages, and this is something that is replicated here, looking at something that is more similar to the export of services rather than permanent migration. So why does that happen? It can happen for various reasons. One reason why this is not happening is there isn't out-migration of workers. So this is not happening because there are general equilibrium effects that local workers migrate out of areas where posted workers arrive. This is mostly because incumbent workers, local workers, typically are protected by wage negotiation, and in some cases they're bumped up the occupation ladders by the arrival of this kind of temporary migrants. Now, in the very little time left, I'll give you a very brief snapshot of what one can expect from the change in welfare from this kind of job posting policy. In this case, welfare mostly accrues to the sending country. So this calibration about welfare refers to the sending country. So for example, Poland in the previous example. For the sending countries, this implies an enormous increase in welfare, a remarkable increase in welfare, mostly due to higher wages at destination and higher increases in productivity in the sending firms. So to sort of wrap up and conclude, what kind of takeaway points can we learn from existing evidence in international trading goods, and what can be exported to evidence on international trading services? So evidence from the past 2 decades has taught us lessons on various impacts of globalization in goods. So we have seen changes in employment, inequality, and inflation. Much less is known about globalization in services, to which the exposure in rich countries will be much larger. Now, one point about globalization in services is that employment changes, basically the impacts on inequality are probably different. And now the important question is probably at time of rising inflation, rising concerns about inflation, the question is, will globalization in services help to reduce prices or to slow down inflation? Now the evidence here is at very early stage, but whatever evidence is available points to the fact that the impact of price of services is very similar to the impact of price of goods. So the few studies that we have point at very similar impacts in terms of inflation. Now I should also mention that those studies have an approach that is more modest than what Richard was advocating before, because those studies cannot use detailed prices of imported services. They typically take a reduced form approach and they look at the correlation between trade openness in various services, intermediate sectors as well, and the correlation between final prices. So we don't know the whole chain of transmission, but the evidence that we have so far is relatively similar to what we know from goods. Now, of course, this evidence is too limited and is still too early to extrapolate to the broader, bigger picture when service trade will expand further. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for a very interesting discussion. And if you take the presentation and the discussion, you can see this is a huge topic. It covers such a wide range. And I think some of the other topics we didn't even get to so far is, of course, the interconnection with also multinational firms. Because, again, you might imagine, I mean, we know already a lot of services trade is within the firm. So I don't go and search the world for the suppliers of services, but if I contract with some domestic firm, they may well be outsourcing within the firm or to their partners around the world to provide those services, intermediate services. Also, whenever we talk about globalization here in the European Union, there's also a dimension of, okay, is it different within the single market? And for services, with the posted worker point that Barbara raised, and other ways that a single European labour market works, it's probably quite different. So with that, let me try and collect some questions, initially from here in the room, and then let's see online. So please, you may be rusty about putting up your hand, but the history of Sintra is people are well able to put up their hand. So I see two, so I'm going to go with Kristen Forbes and then with Volker. So Kristen, and please wait for the mic, of course.
Thanks very much. So there's this fact out there that the shared global component of CPI inflation has increased quite dramatically, but there has not been an increase in the shared global component of service inflation, wage inflation, core inflation. Or put slightly differently, if you look at, say, advanced economies, global factors seem to be driving about 90% of the movement in CPI inflation, but global factors do not play nearly as big a role in wage inflation, core inflation, in the role of the global component of sort of core inflation, wage inflation has not increased over time since 2000, since 2010, whatever the starting point is. So I've been trying to square that fact with all the results you presented on this globalization of services, increased trade of services. I hit a couple of potential explanations for what seems like a disconnect, because it seems like as service trade increases, services become more globalized, it should play a bigger role in shared inflation around the world. So I hit a couple